So the thing that I'm talking to you all today about is temptation. And it's something of like, how in the world do we overcome temptation? But before I even start, I want you all to know this ahead of time, because I want you all to be thinking about this idea in your head. So before I even go anywhere, I want you all to be thinking right now that temptation should be the most like disgusting, most like unappealing thing that we have in our life. Which kind of sounds weird because we think of temptation as something good, but I want you all to think of temptation as something that's just disgusting, okay? And I'll explain that more later. But I was going through and I'm like, what's a good video clip that I can show that like really shows this? And the first thing that I came to was a movie called Big Fat Liar. If anyone has seen that movie, a long time ago. But can you all roll the clip?
Jason Shepherd, did you just come in from that window?
No, you looked a little flushed. I was just creating a cross draft.
Well, now that we're all comfortable, why don't you read us your story?
You know what? Let's give someone else a chance.
No, I think we'd all like to hear yours. You did do it, didn't you?
Miss Caldwell, can I call you Phyllis?
No.
Understood. But as much as I wanted to write my paper, I mean, I really, really wanted to write my paper, I couldn't. And it's because I spent all last night in the Greenberry General Emergency Room. See, my mom made Swedish meatballs for dinner. It's my dad's favorite. And he was so excited, he accidentally swallowed one whole. It was awful. He started choking, his face turned purple, the meatball was literally bulging out of his neck. We rushed him to the ER. I kept trying to write my paper in the waiting room, but it was too hard. I needed to be by my father's side. After all, he's the only dad I got.
You are lying through your teeth, you little demon.
I wish I were, Phyllis. Call my dad if you want. His number is 555-0147.
I think I will.
Crazy? You're totally gonna get busted.
Say Harry Shepherd's office.
No way, don't drag me into this.
Come on, help me out. What am I supposed to do?
How about write the paper?
Do it.
No.
Do it.
No! Harry Shepherd's office, one moment, please.
Hello. Oh, hello, Miss Caldwell. Yes, it's true. It was terrifying. I started to see the white light. I was just about to cross over to the other side when I heard the voice of an angel calling out. And when I opened my eyes, I saw my sweet, sweet Jason standing over me. And I said, "Back off, Grim Reaper. I ain't done living yet." And with every ounce of gas I had left in my body, I burnt that meatball right across the room. And I owe it all to my son. I'm sorry, Miss Caldwell. I should stop talking now. My throat is still very sore. Thank you.
Jason? I am so sorry. You just take your time.
Take your time. So I remember that movie and I was like, if that was me during school, like, wouldn't that just be such an easy life? Like, just lie your way through your whole school life, and like, if you had a paper due, don't do it. But I'm like, how many times do we have this situation where like, man, I wish I could just like lie my way through this? Or what about if I could just do this and get past this, you know? And so I was like, what's a story in the Bible that kind of goes along with this? And when I talked about Abraham going out to Egypt, it's kind of a funny story of what happened. So Abraham and his wife Sarah were moving down to Egypt because there was a famine in the land where they were at. And so as they're going down to Egypt and they're walking through the town, all these Egyptian guys are like, who is that woman? And they were just like so attracted to her. And Abraham was like, okay, I need to probably do something about this. So as they kept going, he talked to Sarah and he said, hey, I want to call you my sister so that way you'll be safe and that way I'll be safe and we'll get through this together. And why? I don't know. But anyway, so he had lied his way through the situation, and what happened was Pharaoh's officials came and saw her, and they thought she was gorgeous. So they led her to Pharaoh, and what ended up happening was he had dinner with her, and he was just like in love with her, like googly eyes and everything, okay? And what the crazy thing was though, God was like, okay, this is not right because this should not be happening. So diseases actually came on Pharaoh's people and on him, and he's like, dude, what is happening? And he finally comes out and asks and figures out that Sarah is actually Abraham's wife, not his sister. And he's like, this is disgusting. So he throws her out and says, Abraham, take whatever you want with you, okay? You can have sheep, cattle, because that's what was important back then. So sheep, cattle, whatever else, you can have all of that. And so he was able to go back to his land and settle there. And so it's kind of cool because we see in this example how God was like, I promised you something, and even though you had lied your way through it, I'm still going to bless you through that. So with that in mind, I want you all to be thinking about this question, and it's, what temptation right now is hindering your faith from either growing or being discovered? Because if you're new here, your faith isn't that strong yet. So what thing is hindering your faith from being discovered? Okay? So as I was going into this, I'm like, okay, how in the world can I study this topic of temptation? Because this is such a broad topic. And so I said, okay, well, first let's start off, like, what is temptation? Like, it seems like we know what it is, but what really is it? So I looked up the definition, and here's what the definition is. Oh, hi, teacher. But it says a desire to do something wrong or unwise. So we know those common temptations that we have going on, but it also says something that's unwise. So I can say a temptation for me is like if I wanted to go cliff jumping and jump off of like a 60-foot cliff. I can do that, right? Like, that's something I can do, but is that wise? Possibly. Who knows? But then I was also looking and I said, okay, if this is a desire to do something wrong, I feel like there's other examples like in the Bible of a different meaning. And so I looked up the Greek word for temptation, and it came up to be this. It also means to test. And keep that in mind because as I talk about a couple of different stories, the word test and temptation are kind of interchangeable. And you'll see how that happens. But as I was thinking, I'm like, okay, what's another like common phrase that we use for like temptation? And the closest thing that I could get to was lust. You know, if there was, and we always think of lust as like us lusting after a woman or vice versa. But lust can be anything that we like really want, right? So for me, I love technology. If y'all didn't know, I get googly-eyed over it all the time. So if there was laptops sitting everywhere, I'd be like, yes, like I'm lusting after this, right? And so I was like, what in the world is lust? Like, what's the definition of it? And it's really ironic because look at the definition. It means a passionate desire for something or a sensual appetite. Sensual meaning I want to feel it, and then an appetite, I want to feel something in my life, right? But this is a passionate desire for something. And I'm like, that's really cool. I looked at both those definitions, and the word desire was in both of them. If y'all haven't seen that, the word desire is in both of them. And what's really cool here in a second, as I'll show you, there's a Bible verse that goes along right with this, with desire. But before I did that, I was like, okay, so if temptation is a desire within us, what happened to like biblical characters? Because we always talk about like the great things that happen with them, right? Like this person was a great example of this. But what about if there was like stories where people were just going through hard times or were tempted by stuff? And let me tell you, there's a lot. There's a lot that happens. And so David, for example, was one of the kings of Israel. And he was like one of the best biblical figures ever. And he had the temptation to have an affair with a married woman, okay? That's pretty bad. Moses was tempted because he was so angry to disobey what God had directly told him to do. And then there's also another guy by Solomon, and he was tempted by his wives, aka wives, that should kind of be a red flag, but his wives to worship idols. And so I was looking through these and I'm like, okay, well, we don't always have like that desire to have an affair with someone, or we don't always get angry at God for this. But what are some like temptations in our life that are really common, right? I was looking, I'm like, one thing that Solomon did was have idols. So we talked about this in discipleship class for those who were there. But what are some idols in our lives that we think about? And the biggest one is our cell phones. If I can think of anything, it would be our cell phones. But behind that, you have social media, relationships, temptations for sports, or other activities that bring you away from God, right? That was me. I was in theater for the longest time, and I was full-heartedly going into that. But I never had time for God. So to me, that was an idol. But then there's other temptations that we don't think about. Like, have you all ever been prideful? Yes, you have. I have. We always want to say, I'm better than you at this, right? But what about there's also, God says that laziness to a degree can be a sin. So if I'm being tempted to be lazy all the time, that's actually a temptation. So there's these little temptations that we have in our life that we don't think about, but are actually there. So I was like, okay, so with this word desire in mind, we have this desire. What is a Bible verse that goes along with this? And I found the best one, I feel like, and it's James 1, 14 through 15. It says, temptation comes from our own desires, which entices us and drags us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. So looking at that, I highlighted this. Temptation comes from our own desires. So what is temptation? It's something that comes from within us. That's really hard to swallow, I feel like, because we're like, oh no, like that's just how I am, or oh, this other situation is causing this. No, temptation can come from within us. And that word desire is actually in this Bible verse. But not only that, looking further, whenever we're tempted, how many times do we feel dragged down by something? How many times are we like, man, I just wish this wasn't in my life, right? It's dragging us down, enticing us. But then it goes even further and says that when we fall into these desires, we have sin. And sin will eventually lead to death. Because God says that I don't like sin. I don't want sin in your life. So I was like, okay, but aren't there times sometimes when like we feel tempted by something that's not us? And I was like, okay, what in the world could this be? And as I was looking, I was like, okay, well, thinking about the story of Jesus. Jesus had a time when he was tested in the wilderness. He went out, and for 40 days, he went on like a whole fasting thing. And while he was there, the devil was tempting him, okay? But he wasn't tempted because he was being tested. See how those are interchangeable? And so Satan, in this case, was testing Jesus. And so I was like, okay, so our temptations come from our own desires within us, and then also from Satan. He's trying to test us or tempt us with something. But I was like, how many times do we think like, God, I feel like you're the one tempting me with this. Like you're the one trying to test me and show me this. But take a verse back, and it says in James 1:13, and remember when you are being tempted, do not say God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. So when we look at this, God is not the one tempting us, okay? Get that through your brains. God's not the one tempting us. Now, Satan may be in our life, and our own desires may be in our life, but God is not the one who's tempting us. Because he's like, I want you to have something even better than that. So looking at what is it, we said that temptation is something that it's a desire that comes from within us, that can lead to sin, and it can also come from the devil, but it's not anything that's a part of God, okay? So then I was like, okay, well, how does it work? Because if we're going to overcome temptation, how in the world does that work? And the first thing that came to my mind was temptation is kind of like bait. For those who have gone fishing, for all of you who probably know that, you throw out the bait on a line, and it just dangles there. And for the fish, it's like right in front of their face. They want that bait. And I kind of think of temptation as we can either go straight towards it, or we can run the opposite direction. Because what's going to happen when you get caught? You're going to get caught, you're going to get killed, turn to fish food. Yeah, you'll have a nice little meal. But besides that, we either have the option to run towards it or run away. And so I was like, okay, is this something that like temptation does? And I feel like temptation is something where we can have the choice to either run towards it or to run the opposite direction, okay? But then I was like, isn't temptation always appealing? Like, isn't that a thing? And looking into it more, I'm like, think about every temptation that you have in your life, okay? Is it going to come to you and say, hey, do you want to like ruin your family life today? Or hey, do you want to go to jail because of this? Or even more like, hey, would you want to die because of this? Like just to do this one thing? Temptation never does that. It never comes to us and says, I want this to happen in your life and it's going to be bad. It's always going to say, hey, this is going to make you feel better, right? This is going to make your situation better. It's always going to be appealing, and it's going to keep nagging at us. And the best way I could thought to describe this was when I was watching this documentary on Netflix, and it's called The Heart of Man. And it's going through and talking about a guy's lusting desires for a woman, and all these guys who had gone through affairs and just tragic situations with women. But as this story was going on, there was this beautiful picture being painted. And it was of this guy and God together. And they were together with a bunch of other people on an island. And this island was beautiful, and they were having like dinner with God and just really enjoying his presence. And God was even so willing that he made a violin for this guy. And he put his name on it in like a language that no one could understand. And so he had this violin, and him and God were on a cliff one day, and they were just playing this, looking out over the ocean. And this guy was just feeling something down within him. And he's like, what in the world is this? What is this that is like enticing me right now? And this image of like just a beautiful woman kept coming to his head. And he's like, what in the world? And so as they're sitting here on a cliff, he gets up and looks, and he sees an island out in the distance. And for some reason, he just starts walking towards it and walking towards it. And he turns and he looks at God at one point, and he just stares at him like, what are you doing? Like, where are you going? You have such a good life here. Why are you trying to go over there? And he's like, he just looks back, and he keeps going, and he's like really thinking about what he's doing. And he ends up taking the violin that he has and dropping it off the cliff. So everything he had known with God broke to pieces in a second. And then finally what he did was, as he was standing on the edge, he's like, do I really want to do this? And he kind of thought about it for a minute, and he jumped. So the next scene is he washes up on the shore of this island because he was tossed and turned by the waves, right? And so as he's coming up on the shore, he's like brushing himself off, and he's trying to get his stuff together. But he's on a beautiful beach. I mean, palm trees, nice weather, like blue-green ocean, just beautiful setting. And as he's walking around, he looks up, and he sees a beautiful woman wearing a white robe, the woman that he was thinking about. And she's just kind of walking off in the distance. But as she's walking, she's kind of like fading in and out. If you've ever seen like a movie like that where someone's just like fading away, it was one of those moments. And the guy's like, what in the world's happening? But he's like, I'm still going to go for that. So he's starting to walk after her, and he follows her. And they get to the point where they're in a field, and she's running, and he starts to chase after her. And as he's running, he stops right before they get to a wooded area where she's going into. And she goes in, and he's staying there, and he looks back at where he just ran. And what was really cool is it was like this beautiful plain that for a split second, there was like a glitch. And suddenly it was all like barren wasteland, like an ear-piercing scream, and then went back to normal. And the guy's like, that's weird, but there's this beautiful woman that I'm going to follow, so I'm going to go this way. So he keeps going, and he keeps following her. And what ends up happening is he finds her, and he begins to start like making love to her. Like he's just loving on her so much. And he's kissing her just passionately, and as he brings his face back, he looks at her, and she's a dead body. Like you just see that her skin is just like there's nothing there. Her eyes are sunken in, her hair is all wiry. She's just this dead body that he'd been kissing. And so he like pushes her away and just runs off in the opposite direction. Well, he ends up falling, and as he's on the ground, he wakes up and notices that he's covered in worms and maggots. And as he's doing that, he's looking around, he's just saying that this island is bare. There's nothing on it. And I'm like, that's exactly what temptation is. When we think about it, we're like, it's something that's so beautiful and something that we want so badly, right? But then once we get to that point, we're like, what did I just do? Like, I was just kissing a dead body. And so when I told you all to remember how I want you all to think about temptation being like disgusting, think temptation as that. Think instead of following that beautiful woman, you're following like a dead body off to somewhere where you're not going to want to be. And so I was like, okay, so this is a thing. But then, like, what happens if this keeps coming back? Because I don't know about you, but many temptations that I've had, and probably that you've had, have come back, right? It's like we may fight against it, we may get through one situation, but it comes right back to us. And so I'm like, okay, what's a good story that I can tell? And the best thing that I found was there was a pastor at the age of 78, and they were walking through like this really bad area of town, a bunch of prostitutes everywhere. And he's walking with his friends, and they're just kind of like laughing, joking around what's going on. And as they get past it, they looked and turned at the guy, and he's just going straight forward. And they're like, dude, how are you not like tempted by any of this stuff? And he's like, guys, I have the same blood running through me as I do as a kid. Those temptations are still there. But the only difference is the fact that I've overcome those. I've had the experience and the knowledge to get past that. And I'm like, that's where I want us to be at. I want us to get to that point where we're overcoming the temptations in our life. But here's the thing that we have to remember, that there's two promises that God gives us when we're in that valley. So we know that from last week that his promises do come true. That if he promises us something, it will happen. Well, look back another verse, and in James 1:12, here's the promise. It says, God blesses those who patiently endure testing and temptation. See how there's both of those in there? And it says, afterwards they will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. So God is promising us eternal life. He's guaranteeing it if we can get past these temptations. If we can endure through these situations, he's promising that to us. But I was like, there's something even more. And I found 1 Corinthians 10:13. It says, the temptation in your life are no different from what others experience. And God is faithful. He will not allow the temptations to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, he will show you a way out so that you can endure. So the second promise is that God will provide a way out. Our first promise is that we can endure this, that God is going to promise us eternal life. But then our second promise is that God will provide us a way out. So, okay, now we're starting to see that we know where temptation comes from, but we see that there's a way out, okay? So I was thinking about this, and I'm like, I can go even farther with this. And God says, I believe that he has called us to eliminate temptation at all cost. Because there's a story of Jesus, and he's talking about different temptations in people's lives, right? And he's going on and saying that if your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out. Literally pluck it out. If your hand causes you to tempt and be sinful, cut it off. And God was like, I'm actually serious about this. Like, you don't have to go and chop off your hand, but I'm serious when I mean we have to get to the root of this, and we have to cut that thing out now. So God's telling us this is a big deal. That temptation is something, if we're going to be struggling with it with the rest of our lives, then we need to overcome this. And so here's the strategy that I came up with. First off, I think we need to know ourselves. We need to know where we stand. So if there's something tempting us, we have to know how to say no, right? We have to be like, okay, I know this is what tempts me, and I have to be okay with that, right? And then the second thing I was like, we have to make up our minds to say no in advance. So if you think about it, and I'm like, I'm tempted by this, whatever this is, and I'm tempted by that, I'm going to say no in advance to that. I'm going to be praying on it. I'm going to be thinking about it. I'm just going to say no, because that's something I don't need in my life. So when we do this, we're kind of building up like that immunity to it, right? Like the more and more we keep saying it, the more that when that moment comes, it's not going to be appealing. It's not going to be tempting. But then even more, I found Mark 14:38. It says, keep watch and pray so that you will not give in to temptation. For the spirit is willing, but the body is weak. So saying that I am weak. Like I physically cannot overcome my temptations, but my spirit is willing to. I want to so badly. And this is saying that when we have these temptations, God tells us to keep watch and pray. But also, before he even said pray about it, keep watch over it. Keep watch and know things cause those desires to happen, okay? And then he says, then you can come to me and pray about it and say, God, I don't want these things to happen when they come. So now we're inviting God into the picture. But before that, I said we should tell an accountability partner. We should tell someone that we know, whether that's a small group leader, a friend that we have. I know we talk about this all the time, but it's something I don't feel like we take advantage of enough. It's something where we have people in our lives that are willing to help, but we're not willing to going to see them to actually figure it out. And I was like, I found Hebrews 10. It says that we should all be meeting together and encouraging one another. In James 5, it says, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another. Because it says the prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. So God's saying that we can do this. As a family, as a church, we can overcome temptation. If we're talking about it and bringing that temptation into light, like what we talked about with CIY, those temptations can be gone from our lives. Or we can endure them. And I thought about this and I'm like, how cool is this? I think I would rather walk into a small group saying I'm struggling with being tempted by this. I'd rather say I'm going into this situation and I'm really nervous that this is going to happen than actually saying I'm in that sin. Think about that. Wouldn't you much rather walk into a group and say I'm struggling with something, but I haven't fallen into it yet? I think that makes it so much more of a lighter subject that we can actually deal with. It brings it to the surface so that way we can talk about it, right? But I said beyond that, we need to focus on our life with God. That everything we do, we have to be talking to him. If we're reading our scriptures and knowing what God says, that's how Jesus fought against Satan, right? When he was being tested, he fought with scripture because he knew God's word. Beyond that, though, we should be building up our prayer life. We talk about these all the time, but this is the ingredients of what we need to overcome sin. And I don't know about you, but if I'm getting strength from someone and someone's promising me that they will give me strength, I kind of want to know who that person is, right? I don't want to just be saying that to someone and I don't know what their promise is and it could be loose about this. No, I want it to be something where I know this person. And then finally, the fruit of the Spirit. We don't think about this often, but when we have God in us, there's a thing called the fruit that we can bear through that. And one of those fruits is self-control. So we know that when God is working in our life and when we have the Spirit in us, that self-control is going to be a thing that is given to us. So here's the deal, guys. We have a way out. But you may be asking, why in the world should I care? You may be in the place where you're like, this temptation and this sin allow me to be happy in life. Like, my situation is so bad that this allows me to be happy. But why in the world should I care? Because we've talked about what is it? Temptation is a desire that comes from within us or Satan. How does it work? It entices us. It's like that bait or that island. It's drawing us near to it. And it gives us two paths that we can either go towards it or we can run as far away as we can. And then we also have to know that we have people around us that can help in our lives. And we have a strategy. So for those asking, why in the world should I care? God calls us to be holy. And in 1 Peter 1:14, it says, as obedient children, remember those who went to CIY, we talked about obedience. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. Remember that word, ignorance. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all that you do. He's calling us to be holy so that way when we go out and we can start changing this world, we can actually do it effectively. That when we're coming to someone, we can say, hey, I've been through this temptation or I've been through this struggle. Let me help you with that. But something that we have to overcome temptation to be doing that. But even more than that, guys, this says in this verse, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you were once ignorant. Guess what? None of you all are ignorant anymore. I'm not ignorant of this topic anymore. I told you what it is, how we can overcome it, what the promises God has for us. So we are no longer living in ignorance. There's absolutely no excuse for you to say, I don't know what I'm doing and I don't know how to overcome it. There's no excuse. So guys, my encouragement to you all is that this is going to be a constant struggle, something that we are always going to be going through. But it's something that when we're called to being holy, remember this, we will stumble and we will fall. This will be a thing that will happen. In Proverbs 24:16, it says, the godly may trip 7 times, but they will get up again. But one disaster is enough to overthrow the wicked. So it's saying that God's reassuring us, when you fall, it's okay. Get back up. Because you know me. You have something in your life that is a solid foundation. So get back up because you can. But the wicked people they lay there and they lay in their sin. They lay in whatever they're doing. It's like they just stay on the ground with the dead body with maggots and worms covered in them. And so, guys, when I think about this, I'm like, there's so much weight to this. That if we can start to overcome these temptations, we can begin to see change. And so I want to leave you with this thought. If we ever want to be known as a youth group who's actively seeking God's will and impacting this world, if we want to be effective, we have to accept that God commands us. He doesn't just ask us, he commands us to take any means necessary connection with the attractive force that's called temptation and ourselves. We've got to overcome this because when we do, there's so many great things in store for us and that there's actually change to be done. So with that being said, I want to pray with you all.